out. I think actually it kind of goes well with, I think out kind of goes well with one art. In one art, we're thinking about a loss and understatement. Let's go to out and talk about this. Does anyone know out is a quote? Does anyone know what it's a quote from? If I tell you it's a Shakespeare quote, would that help? No? Okay, so we're in Macbeth, and there's a passage that says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllables of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow. A poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And the Shakespeare passage is talking about how brief and insignificant life is, right? It's a little dark, and this poem is a little dark that's thinking about it, okay? Somebody summarize this poem for me. That's a skill you're going to use in your essay. Summarize this poem for me. What happened? Volunteer or be drafted. I'm going to call on you if nobody can tell me. Kobe, can you summarize what happens in this poem? Okay. Brooks, can you summarize this one? I did, sir. Did you walk away on me? All right. Did you read out and can you summarize it for us? What's happening here? I gave you more than a half an hour to read these poems. They don't take that long. What happened in the break? That's not appropriate. This is not a break from work. It's a break from Zoom. All right. I love you, but I expect you to use that break time wisely. Who read this during the break, please? Okay. Well, I can work with that. All right, Jayla. So tell me what you think it's about and what you think happens, and we'll start from there. Yes. So far, so good. It's about a young boy. And he's working. Yep. What's he working at? What equipment is he using? I do. Talk to me, sir. Yep. And what happens? Yeah, he bled out. Yeah. So this is pretty dark. It's a young boy who's working on a farm. He's old enough to do this kind of work, but young enough that he still would like to be playing. And it says, so Robert Frost is personifying the saw, or well, he's making it into a monster. At the word the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meaning. What kind of a saw are we talking about? Big, small? It is a big saw, big enough to cut timber. and it runs continuously. So if you're not using the proper equipment or if you're not working right, it could drag your hand in, and that's what happens with the boy. The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh. What does rueful mean? Yeah, unhappy. It's like, oh Lord, it's a bad laugh. It's not a good happy laugh. A rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know. Big boy doing a man's work, though a child at heart. He saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes, don't let him, sister. So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. What is ether? Got to look up the words you don't know. What's ether? Get you to Google or your dictionary on your phone and tell me what ether is. Does that seem to be the definition that would fit? Let's see if there's a secondary definition. Nope, still looking. Nope. What dictionary are you all using? No. Yeah, definition number 1 for ether in Google, define ether is what? That is highly flammable. It is used as an anesthetic, as a solvent or intermediate in industrial processes. So what is ether here? It's a gas being used for what? What's an anesthetic? Yes. Okay. So when it says that they put him in the gas of ether, then we're when it says gas of ether, then we're talking about that they're putting him, they're helping him sleep. They're putting him under. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart, little less, nothing, and that ended it. No more to build on there, and they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. Now that seems really cold. It seems even more callous than comparing it to moving out of a city, right? It seems almost monstrous. Why would a poet want to make it seem monstrous for these people to turn to their affairs? Why would he do that? It's not because New Englanders don't have feelings. That's not it. What's really going on here? The first question we've got to ask ourselves is, what affairs are they turning to? When somebody dies, it's not just nothing. What do you have to do if someone in your family dies? You have to plan a funeral, you have to dispose of the body, bury it, or cremate it. You have to clean up if there's a mess. What else do these people have to do for their affairs? They have to run that farm. What happens to cows if you don't milk them? they can get blocked, infected, and stop producing milk entirely. What happens to chickens if you don't collect their eggs? They hatch, and then you have chickens and no eggs. And the chickens will stop laying eggs because they're trying to brood and hatch the eggs they already laid, right? So a farm falls apart if you don't work it, right? It's not like you can take 2 weeks off from work on a farm. You just can't. What happens to your crops if you don't tend them? Is that bugs will get them, or they won't get watered, or they won't get weeded, and they get ruined, right? Does it seem monstrous to go to work and do all these things after a kid has died? It absolutely does. And I would venture to say that if your kid has died the way Robert Frost's kid died, existing at all seems pretty monstrous, right? The fact that, but why do they have to turn to their affairs? It says it right in this last line. Why do they have to turn to their affairs? Because they're not the ones who are dead. And I think he lets it seem monstrous and callous and unfeeling on purpose, because I think he wants to capture how awful it seems to the living to continue living after something like this has happened. And he wants us to all feel a little awful at the fact that we are not the ones dead and we've got to keep going. It's an awful moment when someone you love, especially if it's a child, has passed and you have to get up in the morning. You don't want to do it, but you have to, because you're not the one that's dead. And it's brutal. It's a brutal poem. It's not meant to be easy. All right, other poems that you would like to discuss. That one was my pick because it kind of was a little bit the same as One Art, where you might miss the depth of feeling there if you're not careful. But let's talk about some of the others here. Perhaps some of the ones dealing with race issues. What do we want to talk about? We've got The Poor, we've got Saturday's Child, we've got Riot, we've got Harlem, we've got Incident. What are we going to talk about next? Saturday's Child. All right, Saturday's Child. What about it? What form is this? Anybody recognize this form? Yes, ma'am. Who said that? Where's me? Angel, you're smarty pants today. Thank you, my dear. It is a ballad. Good job. Some are teased on a silver spoon with stars strung for a rattle. I cut my teeth as the black raccoon for implements of battle. Some are swaddled in silk and down and heralded by a star. They swathed my limbs in a sackcloth gown on a night that was black as tar. For some, Godfather and Goddam, as in Godmother, the opulent fairies be. Dame Poverty gave me my name, and Pain godfathered me. For I was born on Saturday. Bad time for planting a seed, was all my father had to say, and one more mouth to feed. Death cut the strings that gave me life, and handed me to sorrow. My only kind of midwife, like somebody who helps deliver a baby, my folks could beg or borrow. All right. What on earth is he talking about? First of all, are you aware that there is a little saying things like what all it means for each person to be born on a different day? Like Wednesday's child is full of woe. For some reason, I was born on a Wednesday, and that always bothered me that was mine. But Saturday's saying is bad time for planting a seed, I guess, right? So he's thinking about this old set of weird sayings about what it means if you were born on a certain day, kind of like a horoscope, right? And he's talking about being Saturday's child. And I'll see if I can find that poem for you at some point, but it's weird and I hate it, so I didn't attach it here. But what is he talking about his own birth here? What does he know about his own birth? Was he a wanted child or an accident? How do we know that? Good. Imbalanced. Okay. Are these supposed to be complete sentences? They were acting immature. He stood on his hind legs. Capital he was imbalanced. Yes? You need to correct those?
I don't know.
I want you to do your best work for your teacher. What does your teacher expect? Exactly. All right. All right. You can be mad, but you know you got to get it done right. All right. Don't erase the whole thing when you can erase a tiny part of it. That makes it harder than it needs to be. Just fix the things that need to be fixed. Sorry, y'all. Okay, that's good advice, though. Okay, so he's been told he's one more mouth to feed. Has anybody here dealt with knowing that you were one more mouth to feed? I hope not. I'm very lucky. I was told I was wanted, and they were all very happy to see me, but I'm lucky that way. He was not born that way. He was not born and given a silver spoon and teeth. He was born into poverty and difficulty, had to be ready to fight right out of the gate. Why? Why is he says the only kind, death cut the strings that gave me life and handed me to sorrow, the only kind of middle wife my folks could beg or borrow. What does that tell us about his parents? It tells us a couple of very important things about his parents. Yes, mom died in childbirth, right? Because they couldn't get a midwife, probably. They couldn't get anybody to help with the birth. All right, keep in mind some cultural context for this. People are having their births mostly at home at this point in our history. We're not going to the hospital for births. We're mostly having them at home. But people who could afford one might have had a midwife come to help, who would have been trained in case of complications, right? But these folks are impoverished. Not an easy life. What about the opulent fairies? Who are they talking about with the opulent fairies? It's a fairy tale, and I bet you've heard of it. Where did the fairies show up and give somebody a name? Sleeping Beauty? Anybody remember that one? Story of Aurora, where the fairies show up and they bless her with things. And that didn't happen here. This wasn't fancy. It wasn't a fairy tale. All right. Questions about this poem? Things you don't understand? All right. The next poem we're going to discuss is what? What's next? Are we going to deal with incident at all or no thank you? Kayla says no. Does anybody want to deal with it or are we skipping it? All right, you're missing out. All right, you're missing out. Let's deal with Riot then. All right, tell me about this poem. Who's writing it? No, she starts with a quote by Martin Luther King, but that's not who wrote it. Who wrote it? All right, Gwendolyn Brooks. She is quoting Martin Luther King. A riot is the language of the unheard. You might have seen that on social media a lot yesterday or recently. John, I'm going to read it because I think the scansion makes it difficult to read. John Cabot, out of Wilma, once a Wycliffe, all about white blue rose below his golden hair, wrapped richly in right linen and right wool, almost forgot his jaguar and Lake Bluff, almost forgot Grand Tully, which is the best thing that ever happened to Scotch, almost forgot the sculpture at the Richard Gray and Distelheim, the kidney pie at Maxim's, the grenadine at Bouffe de Maison-Henri. Because the Negroes were coming down the street. Because the poor were sweaty and unpretty, not like two dainty Negroes in Winnetka, and they were coming toward him in rough ranks, in seas, in windsweep. They were black and loud, and not detainable, and not discreet. Gross, gross, coûte grossière, John Cabot itched instantly beneath the nourished white that told his story of glory to the world. Don't let it touch me, the blackness, Lord, he whispered to any handy angel in the sky. But in a thrilling announcement, on it drove and breathed on him and touched him. And in that breath, the fume of pigfoot, chitlin, and cheap chili, malign, mocked John, and in terrific touch, old averted doubt jerked forward decently and cried, Cabot, John, you are a desperate man, and the desperate die expensively today. And John Cabot went down in the smoke and fire and broken glass and blood, and he cried, Lord, forgive these that they know not what they do. And I'm going to skip that word because that's the same offensive word that was in the other poem. All right. Now, this is about a riot, and this is about a white man named John Cabot who was killed in a riot. What do we think of this poem? This is a rough one. This is a rough poem. They describe John Cabot here as a very rich man, someone with a jaguar, who goes to fancy French restaurants, and he's forgotten all about it. Why? What's coming? All right, it's important that there are references to the French here because a lot of this is thinking about the French Revolution. What do we know about the French Revolution? Anything? In the French Revolution, the poor rose up and killed the rich, killed the rich and the ruling class. They killed their kings and queens and nobility and took over the government. The poor did that. I think there's a reason John Cabot is being painted as someone who is richly wrapped in right linen and right wool and eats at French restaurants and all this fancy stuff. And he's being overtaken. By whom? By whom is he being overtaken? More particularly, he's gotten caught up in a riot of people who are. This describes the people who are rioting. The poor were sweaty and unpretty, and they were coming toward him in rough ranks, in seas, in windsweep. They were black and loud and not detainable and not discreet. Now, keep in mind. Gwendolyn Brooks is an African-American author who's writing about this, and she's not on John Cabot's side. Why? She starts out quoting Martin Luther King saying the riot is the language of the unheard. What is she getting at here? This is some radical stuff. What's she talking about? John Cabot went down in the smoke and fire, and he cried, Lord, forgive them, they know not what they do. Now, and he's also using a racist word. Then in the minute he goes down, he's still saying racist things. What is going on with Gwendolyn Brooks here? What's she at? What is she working on? What's she trying to say? What point is she trying to prove? Yeah, that and I think we'll need to read Harlem to maybe go with this poem. But that when a portion of the country is oppressed aggressively for long enough, it's going to rise up. It did in France. It does it here periodically, right? And we still haven't really solved these problems. We had riots again this past summer for the same reasons, right? That people are still feeling unequal and oppressed, and it still got violent. Because I think largely because people are still feeling unheard. I think that's what also happened in Washington a while ago. When people feel like they're being unheard, they rise up and fight. Yes, ma'am, I will take these. Thank you very much. You may go outside and play till I'm done. Okay. All right. So it's, and what do we make of the language that she uses? She seems as though she's using negative words about the people whose side she's on. Why would she do that? Why would she use this N-word here? And why would she say black and loud and not detainable and not discreet? Why would she do that? Let's start with they were black and loud and not detainable and not discreet. Why is that praise? Why is that a good thing to the author? Why is that a good thing? Yeah, and you got to remember people, black people had been told to stay in their place. Like literally, that was a phrase, to stay quiet. And when they didn't, violence was wreaked upon them. There were lynchings and there were lynch mobs and there were all sorts of violence perpetrated against black people who stepped out of line at this point in time. And out of line is in quotation marks, of course. But any perceived breach of discretion, of not being discreet, is usually met with violence against the black person. And the tables have turned here on John Cabot. And they're not being discreet. They're not being detainable. They're being loud and actually violent, right? And he went down in smoke and fire. What do we make of his last words? Why? It's really ugly. This is a really ugly poem about a really ugly time. And it's hard to grapple with. It's hard to grapple with how thoroughly fine the author is with someone having died in a riot. And yet, he's a despised character to her, this John Cabot. He represents everything that has been oppressing people like her for centuries at this point. All right, so I want to pair this with Harlem. Let's take a look at Harlem for a moment because I think this kind of goes together. They go together. By Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode, right? And Langston Hughes is writing around the same time as Gwendolyn Brooks. They're thinking about the same things, and they're thinking about this promise of Martin Luther King, who had a dream, right? And they're thinking about that dream. When he says what happens to a dream deferred, you better know he's talking about Martin Luther King's dream, right? And he said, what does it mean to be deferred? What does that word mean? Yeah, well, no, not quite. Put off, right? So if you defer an acceptance to a college, you're putting it off for a year. So it's put off until later. So it's like, yeah, we'll give you equality, but later, right? And what happens to that dream when it's deferred and made later and later and later? And they're saying, does it dry up? And then it's in italics, does it explode? What does it look like when that dream of equality explodes? Well, y'all, it looks like riot, right? When people are promised equality and they don't get it, and they don't get it, and they don't get it, this happens, right? This is what happens. And it happens with any group of disenfranchised people, right? All right. Thoughts on either of those poems from you? Other poems that you need to discuss before we start writing? All right. I have changed a little bit what we're working on this week. So let me go over it with you. It looked like a little too much, so I've scaled it back just a little bit. I still want you to do to join Remind for me, please. And make sure you do the readings. If you weren't really participating in today's readings, you need to go back and read those out loud. And please remember that when I give you a break in between the beginning of our class and the end of our class, that is not a break to do anything except the work that I have assigned you to do in the meantime. You don't go get a snack. You don't attend to another class. You do the things that I've asked you to do in between those two times. They are designed to take up the entire amount of time I've given you. If you do them and then you have time to get yourself a snack, do those things in that order, please. Print and read the sample essay, and we're going to go over that in a minute. Using quote basics, we already went over in the first half of class. The essay jobs checklist we want you to go over, and the source use quiz. Okay, now poetry discussion is asking you to write a 10 to 12 sentence paragraph discussing a theme that runs through 3 poems by at least 2 different authors. This is prepping you for our essay. There's that handout on theme versus thesis that we went over. The poetry theme essay requirements. So let's read through those together. I'm going to open that right now. Okay. This essay must be a minimum of 5 paragraphs. It may be more. The essay must have these elements: a thesis paragraph, 3 body paragraphs, and a concluding paragraph. All paragraphs should be at least 10 sentences in length. It must be a minimum of 750 words. It should be more than that. Students must use 3 separate poems for this essay. You must devote at least 1 full paragraph to each poem. So your body paragraphs, your 3 body paragraphs, should be 1 paragraph per poem. Okay? Students must use at least 2 authors for this essay. You may not use all 3 poems by the same poet. Students must quote directly at least 3 times from each poem. Keep individual quotes short and put your analysis between quotes. Do not quote more than 4 lines of poetry at once unless they are very short lines. Okay? Students must provide in-text citations for every quote. They should be in this format, lines 1 through 3. Students must use a slash to indicate where the line breaks in the original poem falls. So much depends upon, so I remind you how to do that, and I'll put our practice in Blackboard for you as well. Students must include a works cited list at the end of their essay. Please use the handout for formatting your works cited list. Most students will use the online version of the poems and so should follow that model. And I'll go over that with you before we hang up. Essays should be carefully edited for spelling, grammar, capitalization, punctuation, spacing, and format. Okay, and there's a sample essay that shows you all of those things. Okay. I'm going to go over this next, the handout for the works cited list for the poems. Okay. Now, if you have the paper copy of the textbook these came from, you can use that, but I don't think anybody does because we're not even requiring it anymore. But if you have a used copy, you can. We're going to download this. All right. So this is for citing a poem online. The works cited list entries should include 6 elements: the author's name, the poem title in quotation marks, the website title in italics, the date the poem was posted in month, year, day, in day, month, year order, the publication medium, which is web, and the date you accessed the poem. So then you alphabetize the entire works cited list so that it looks like these, okay? So these are the examples: Frost, comma, Robert, period. Fire and ice with the capitals for the different words in the poem, period, quotation marks. It came from the website Poem Hunter. There's the date that it was published. It was published on the web, and it was from February, and I accessed it on February of last year, okay? So you can see that this one was it just had the date 2000, so I didn't have a month and day, so I just used the year. That's fine, okay? All right, this one is missing the word web. But this is the pattern yours should follow. And I'm actually gonna close this because it's here for you to look at your leisure. So that handout is there for you. Make sure you read it out loud. Anything that's difficult, you should read out loud. There's this. So we have 2 small assignments this week instead of the draft. So 1 second, please. What? I don't know what's going on with the crossouts.
Oh, I knew, but I didn't know.
Okay, thank you. Good. All right. So we have, I'm going to go through both of them first. I had to update that one. So there are 2 short assignments instead of the draft because the draft was going to be, I think, too much to do all at once. This will give you some feedback on what I'm asking you to do for the pieces of this. So you're going to do 3 pieces of this and get feedback on it and then do the rest of the draft. And the pieces are 1 close reading about a poem, and you have in here a sample paragraph about a poem. So make sure you read that sample paragraph about a poem to see what you're aiming for, okay? And then it says the instructions say, please choose one of the poems you plan to write about and the thesis you are planning to support and write a trial run paragraph about it using, write a trial run paragraph about it using the source use practices we learned in class. A sample paragraph is below to help you remember what we're aiming for. Okay, so that's the first assignment. The second assignment asks you to do a draft of your thesis paragraph, and it tells you the pieces that go into a thesis paragraph in kind of a bossy way, okay? 2 to 3 sentences raising the idea of your theme naturally, 2 to 3 sentences introducing the poems and poets that you think touch on this theme, 1 clear sentence stating your thesis, 3 sentences, 1 about each poem, stating how that poem supports your thesis as a little preview, and then 1 sentence getting us ready to discuss the first poem in some more depth. So that just reminds you what goes into a thesis paragraph in an essay like this. And then part 2, and these go in the same assignment, is to give a draft of that works cited list. So this way you're going to do 3 paragraphs out of your 2 paragraphs out of your 5-paragraph essay and an attempt at the works cited list. You're going to get feedback on that, and then next week you'll use that feedback and you'll finish the draft. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. If you have questions about what you need to do this week, stay on. Or if you're having problems with something, stay on. If you know what you're doing and you feel equipped to do it, you can log out. Yes, ma'am.